Great. I can see a few more people coming in, and we're at our scheduled start time, so we'll kick this one off. So thank you all for joining us at our third interview as part of the Operation TS Technology interview series. Today's interview is with Jeremy Dombal, a solutions engineer from S&P Global Market Intelligence. And the topic for today's interview is looking at emerging company trends and deceptive shipping practices. So I'm really excited to dig into this with Jeremy. We have recently had a bit of a collaboration with S&P, which is great, not only around Operation TS, but also integrating the S&P ownership information into Starboard as part of a joint sort of collaboration between the businesses, which is allowing us to look at a wider view of relationships through off-water networks and behaviours and vessel information. And we're lucky to have Jeremy because he's actually authored a fantastic paper on the Maritime State of Play report, Deceptive Shipping Practices. So I'm really keen to dig into this a bit more with Jeremy today. As we go through this, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A. We'll aim to answer those at the end of the discussion. But for now, I'd like to just introduce Jeremy. And Jeremy, talk us through what a solutions engineer is at S&P. What are you doing all day?
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for having me. And good morning, good afternoon, good everyone here. So, solutions engineer. So we provide technical expertise in terms of how our capabilities can be applied to bridge some of the challenges and needs within industry. We also engage in sort of project work to help identify trends, themes, and developments, and identify white spaces. So it really is sort of that middle ground between the technology standpoint and some of the needs. And then my area of interest is surrounding risk and compliance as it relates to shipping, particularly that of maritime domain awareness and deceptive shipping practices.
Nice. And so in that paper, which I just referred to before, and we'll send the link around so you can kind of have a chance if you're watching this interview to go and sign up and read the paper. It's an excellent summary of this new sort of or growing area of concern. In your paper, Jeremy, you highlighted 7 practices in there that the US Treasury Department Office of Foreign Assets Control had sort of indicated as part of their guidance around deceptive shipping practices. Can you just give us a bit more of an insight about these 7 practices and how you think things have shifted since these were first released in 2020?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great area of interest in the realm of compliance, and it probably merits far longer than I'll dedicate in terms of response time. But essentially, these are common practices or elements of interest for those which operate within the maritime industry or who have ties or exposure to this domain when carrying out their due diligence process. So those 7 in themselves encapsulate the disabling or manipulation of AIS. There's the alteration of vessel identifiers, particularly the physical elements. That was in that guidance. Falsification of cargo or vessel documents. This notion of transshipment through ship-to-ship operations. Voyage irregularities, use of false flags or flag hopping, and then finally sort of convolution when it comes to the ownership and management of vessels, or they described complex ownership or management. So these are the sort of those 7 fundamentals which have been used to sort of underpin some of these due diligence processes in May 2020, and things have changed slightly. The landscape has evolved as it does with these sorts of things. And even if we look back a couple of weeks, OFAC actually issued another guidance advisory as it relates to the price cap coalition for the Russian Federation, and recommendations which echoed some similar concepts. But even then, there was they put spotlight on transshipment in high-risk areas, but also looking at other elements such as P&I insurance and IX classification due to some of the profile associated to these vessels. So there's these fundamental elements, but it's moving forward. And the fact that these recommendations are continuing to come through just shows how dynamic this landscape is, and that these actors who we're working against, so to speak, are trying to find new ways to slip through the cracks.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on that complex ownership or management piece that you've really sort of done a bit of a deep dive on in your summary paper there. How, as S&P Global Market Intelligence so well placed to kind of understand more about that particular issue?
So the focus on the paper was that last point surrounding the complexities in the ownership and management ties. And so as a company, we're very unique in industry because we're the only one who manage the numbering scheme for ships as well as registered owners and companies. And what that means is that on an asset basis, i.e. for the ships, we have complete visibility on the entirety of the registered fleet, be them new builds, those which are in service or scrapped, because that IMN number stays with that vessel. So we have that visibility. And on the other side, when it comes to the entities themselves, we have transparency in terms of those that operate within this domain. And we can leverage that data set to establish the roles, be them current or historical, that these companies are playing in terms of owning, managing these vessels, and the interlinkages between them as well. So the idea was that we could use that as a means to sort of do a temporal analysis to see how things have shifted over time and identify common trends well, during the last sort of 4 or 5 years as this topic has become increasingly of interest.
Yeah, and it was really interesting to me as I was sort of going through the paper and looking at, you can see almost that immediate reaction to when sanctions are starting to get put in place. Suddenly there's a real spike in vessels that are registered in shell companies and some of these flags of convenience that are being used, and single fleet owners sort of popping up here and there. So it kind of felt like, yeah, there's an immediate kind of response from the market in terms of some of these kind of sanctions being put in place, which I guess shows in some ways the effectiveness initially, and then also how people are trying to kind of work around the rules and work around some of those regulations. In terms of seeing this kind of growth and a bit of a boom in this deceptive practices, what do you think this means for those who are working in maritime domain awareness and compliance and risk? What are the sort of key things that they've got to start to be thinking about?
So it's the fact that this is a dynamic landscape, and that what fundamentally underpins a due diligence process now is not necessarily going to stay that way. It is dynamic. You could refer to it as sort of this intricate game of chess, whereby as we're moving pieces forward and trying to uncover the opposition's next move, the opposition is doing the exact same thing. And as these tactics are underpinned, that's when we sometimes see a shift. And so an example of that would be that one of those concepts, the disabling or manipulation of AIS. If we go back looking at 2020, there was greater emphasis in sort of going dark at that time. There were lots and lots of cases which were established. Whereas now, when we look at it, it's far more leaning towards the notion of manipulation of AIS, particularly location tampering. And although these themselves can somewhat be convincing at initial glance, there's usually irregularities or particulars to be observed to the untrained eye. But identifying those elements can prove challenging, which is why the use of technology and innovation is so critical. So there's this element of collaboration that's really required ultimately to breed that transparency. But just going back, it will continue to change, I suspect.
Yeah, and do you think that you mentioned back in 2020 and people sort of turning off AIS or going dark, and now it's kind of almost that's so much of a red flag that everyone knows about and everyone's looking for it, that actually more subtly sort of tweaking positions and trying to just shave a few degrees here and there, you can still try and do things without maybe waving the red flag.
Correct. I mean, the initial response at that time from many in industry was identifying the gaps in AIS, which it's a challenge in itself because it's not as though you don't see a vessel through AIS. They've gone dark, so to speak. There could be a number of factors therein, but the initial response was identifying those gaps. And so the modus operandi, the MO sort of shifted to, well, how can I continuously be seen through AIS, but continue to conduct these operations while not actually showing that? So that's why the location tampering is sort of becoming quite big, because they will be live, so to speak. The positions will continue to come through, or the messages will continue to come through, but not necessarily reflect the physical location of that vessel.
Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, I've really noticed that actually just looking at vessels within Starboard and looking at the ownership structures and sort of seeing a lot of fleets of one or a lot of single kind of addresses. And I know you highlight there's a few thousand ships registered to basically two addresses out there, which is I found quite intriguing. But yeah, definitely seems there's a lot of moving parts to the piece. It's quite a complex problem as you kind of described there. Just kind of coming back to, I guess, around the oil smuggling piece, sort of more broadly, what are some of those kind of key indicators or data points you feel that organisations and authorities should really be looking out for when trying to prevent oil smuggling, illegal oil smuggling?
So, I mean, so in the paper in itself, so there are 7 sort of takeaway points that we tried to highlight, and the idea was to provide some context to help in that process. But summarizing it in short, it is the fact that there is an increase in the number of companies coming forward and identifying themselves as registered owners to vessels, and even changes within that particular field has been increasing over the last 3 years. That these entities are mostly recently founded, so since 2021. So don't necessarily have a long history of operation within the maritime domain and just pop up out of nowhere. And that there, as you mentioned, that there is sort of a commonality sometimes in the given address where there will be more than one entity at that address. And in the paper, we highlight sort of 2, as you say, which had a number, but it's not necessarily always the case. It can be that there are 5, 6 on the same floor in the same building that can be of interest. And then this notion of single ship fleets, it's to drive the convolution, sort of silo things out, break it apart, make it more difficult to establish these chains. And so, yeah, this notion of single ship fleets sort of has come up where entities will come forward, register themselves, and then immediately adopt a single vessel out of what was historically perhaps a larger fleet.
And so then the work that you guys are starting to look at doing is, I guess, kind of looking at how you can join the dots behind some of those single ship fleets in the background and start to look at some of the direct or indirect maybe linkages behind that. Is that fair to say?
Yes, so there's a lot of different data sets that we can leverage on that front, and doing so is part of the challenge, which we are working. I think a lot of different people, even including yourselves, are working in that to achieve that and underpin some of these behaviors on the entity side, on the vessel side, to try and provide some transparency. But it's not just a case of having ship data, having company data. It's also having sort of access to positions data, even sort of operations related derived movements data, such as being able to identify anomalous positions relating to ships or even events relating to them. So it's trying to marry all of those in terms of what falls in the registered realm, in the digital realm, in the physical realm, bringing those together to try and help breed that transparency. And we partner with, as you say, with yourselves and with a number of different other industry players, be them banks, insurance providers, national, supranational organizations, anyone ultimately who requires correct, complete, consistent, and current data, as well as the expertise that we can lend.
Yeah, I think you're right. Definitely that sort of fusion of multiple sources and multiple views, and yeah, some of the things obviously that we're doing at Starboard around network analysis and looking at those on water fleets, and then obviously from an S&P perspective, who are those owners and beneficial owners, and how are those kind of companies behaving? You do start to sort of get a more complete picture to understand risk and some of the complexity within this kind of area. You mentioned at the top of the call that this is one of a series of papers. You know, there's 7 practices. We sort of dive deep into one of them here. Are there other summaries or other sort of papers that you're in the process of bringing out, and what are they covering off next?
So this was the first in, at the moment, a 3-part series. So the first being looking at the ownership side, and then the second and third looking more in terms of the manipulation piece. So the second to follow will be looking at the manipulation of AIS and how that sort of evolved. And then the third installation will be looking at voyage regularities and what to look out for. Ultimately, the aim is to try and help, as I said, to provide transparency and help industry provide some context to industry players in terms of identifying some of these behaviors.
Yeah, nice. And I think, yeah, one of the key themes there around that kind of collaboration kind of leads me into my next question, just around, how you are working together with other partnerships, or, if there are any sort of notable collaborations that you can share between S&P that you're involved in to kind of combat some of these complex issues like oil smuggling. Is there anything you can kind of highlight?
So as I mentioned, anyone ultimately who requires current, consistent, data in that regard, we've partnered, be them, as I said, banks, the financial institutions are a big part in terms of how we collaborate with them, national, supranational organizations, security agencies. There's a vast array of different personas and different players that we're partnering with to help tackle this particular problem and identifying these types of operations or these networks of interest.
Yeah, fantastic. And just touching on the operations piece, obviously we're going to be working quite closely around Operation TS, which we'll be running next week, live in person in Sydney, and also online for all of those that are attending and can't be at the Indo-Pacific conference. What from being involved in this operation do you sort of feel like yourself or the S&P team are kind of looking to learn of running an operation like this?
That's a great question, and we're very excited for it. And I think part of the answer I gave to one of the other questions lends itself nicely. It is ultimately it requires collaboration of different parts. Breeding innovation requires data, it requires expertise, it requires technology, and all of those are going to be there at Operation TS. So it's very exciting because it sort of creates a dialogue, not only in terms of how we can help each other, but also how the industry themselves face challenges and how we might ourselves apply what we have to address those needs. So it's as much a case of exposing what we have to offer as it is learning more about what the industry challenges are.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good way to kind of sum it up, I think. That idea of actually doing a live and open kind of collaboration between technological partners, trying to tackle an issue in a live kind of area of focus, it will be exactly that. So yeah, it'll be exciting to kind of go through it with you guys. We've come to the end of our time now with Jeremy. I don't know if anyone had any questions in the audience that they wanted to put into the Q&A or anything else they wanted to raise. I'll just leave a couple of minutes for questions. As I mentioned at the top of the meeting, we will be sending these interviews out on video for those that appreciate it's kind of time zones are all over the shop. So we will be sending those out as a follow-up, and as part of that, we will include a link back to the paper that we've been discussing, so that Jeremy has authored, which, just as a reminder, is the Maritime State of Play report on deceptive shipping practices. And yeah, for the deep dive today, we were just focusing on one of those 7 in a bit more detail. So I haven't seen any questions come through. So I'd just like to take this chance to say a big thank you to Jeremy for joining us. Thank you very much. Really appreciated the insights there. And I would encourage all of you to have a read of that paper. It's really fantastic summation of a series of really quite complex problems, and looking forward to the next couple of editions of that as well. So thank you all for joining us. At our 3rd interview, we'll have one more of these to go. Yeah, we'll see you with the next one. And thank you very much for joining us again, Jeremy.
Thank you.